The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Is it mad that the world burning is not in our, top 3 concerns? You thought bad news was done, but I'm back with more. In Alice Snedden's Bad News Saves the World, I finally address the climate crisis and explore why no one cares. Watch it on thespinoff.co.nz.
I can see the anxiety starting to emit from you.
When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network, in partnership with KiwiBank, the bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise and banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi, making Kiwi better off. If you've been listening to When the Facts Change for a while, you probably know I grew up in a pretty remote part of New Zealand, near the town of Murupara. You might know that name because that's where the Prime Minister grew up, and she also went to the same school I did, although it has to be said, I was there 15 years before because I'm quite a bit older. But it was a great rural area, and at the time, the houses seemed quite fine to me. But over the years, Murupara and many of our remote areas have become much tougher, uglier, unhealthier places, because a lot of those houses have not been kept up to scratch. There's been plenty of population growth, and there is as much of a housing crisis in rural and provincial New Zealand as there is in our biggest cities. You only need to look at what's happening in Rotorua to know that we have a housing crisis that affects Māori in particular. Home ownership rates amongst Māori are extremely low, closer to 20% than the 65% that you see for Pākehā populations in New Zealand. The trouble is land ownership. So much of the land was either stolen or fraudulently bought or bought cheaply over the last couple of 100 years. Where once, of course, all of Aotearoa New Zealand was owned by tangata whenua, hardly any is now, and it's broken up into very small parcels, often in rural and provincial New Zealand. But not only that, the parcels are owned by many, many people. In some cases, you could have dozens and dozens of owners of a piece of land and the title on that land, which makes it very difficult to actually make decisions about how to use that land, how to build on it, but also how to borrow money to build houses on that land. Because remember, the great innovation, I suppose you could call it, of modern capitalism, particularly the Anglo-Saxon version of capitalism we have, is the whole idea of unit titles, freehold titles of land owned by individuals, or at most a single family, a trust, or a company. It makes it easy for banks to lend, knowing the ownership of a discrete piece of freehold land is something that they can put a security against. But just imagine if you have a piece of land where you have dozens of owners, some of whom may not even know that they own the land. But there is a huge need to build houses and places to live on that land. This week on When the Facts Change, I speak to Professor Anthony Hoete, who is a professor of architecture at the University of Auckland. But he comes to that role with a really different background to the usual academic. He's arranged and built and designed developments, housing developments, particularly in the UK, but also in Holland, of all places. He comes from the Bay of Plenty, an island just off the coast near Tauranga, and tells us all about this issue of dispersed land title and how it could be solved. This week on When the Facts Change, he talks about using the blockchain and non-fungible tokens, NFTs, as a way to help consolidate some of these land titles, allow people to swap various chunks of land or ownership of land from one place to the next, helping Māori find ways to better use that land, particularly for housing. He also talks about using cross-laminated timber to solve some of these issues. And this is where it's quite exciting, really. We obviously have a problem with climate change, child poverty, and housing affordability. And of course, it's most acute in these areas like Murupara, like the East Coast, Northland, where there is a massive problem with a lack of housing. The housing is not carbon friendly at all. But at the same time, a lot of the iwi land has exotic forests on it. Huge forest plantations of Pinus radiata. Just imagine if those forests could be used to build houses and, more importantly, become carbon sinks that provide affordable, clean, warm, dry housing. This week on When the Facts Change, Professor Anthony Hoete talks about using NFTs to help deal with dispersed land title and using cross-laminated timber to solve one of our major issues, child poverty in the regions, but doing it with affordable housing that becomes a carbon sink and uses a resource which currently is being chopped down and sent off as logs to China, using it locally. That's this week on When the Facts Change. Well, kia ora to Professor Anthony Hoete from Auckland University. Welcome to When the Facts Change.
Kia ora, man.
Tell me your story of how you became, as you said in a presentation I watched, the Brofessor.
So kia ora. So I probably also in that same presentation at Rethinking Housing 2022 also mentioned that even though I'm a professor, I'm not an academic. I'm actually my research and knowledge about housing comes from 20 to 30 years of practice.
Actually doing it?
Doing it. I founded an architectural practice in London called What Architecture, and then that company later transformed into a separate development vehicle called Game of Architecture, which went out and bought things like a railway station and more latterly bought a site which had been blown up by one of Hitler's V2 flying bombs. And so I got into housing, and if I wind the clock back to my beginnings, so ko Mōtiti, tuku Mōtiti, I'm from Mōtiti Island, ko Ngā Te Awa Te Iwi, and my father, strangely, has probably built more houses than I'll ever built. That was sort of an approach to building as a sort of pragmatic. They just literally got blocks and started building whare on the island. And one of the first houses that I completed was a project after I left the University College London doing a master's. I returned home to build a whare on my Te Ranga Waiwai for my father. And this would have been back in 96. So at that time, pretty much like today, Māori didn't really employ architects. In fact, Māori didn't really employ builders either. He just sort of did it. It was a DIY project. And I guess from that sort of modest and humble origins of the architect as builder, 30 years later, I found myself in London doing development and operating as the general contractor as well. So, and I treat that sort of pathway literally from the sort of humble origins of building on the island. And so I was in practice in the UK. Before that, I had been registered as an architect in the Netherlands. What an amazing place for a young architect to be in the mid-90s for the next decade. It was the hotbed of global architecture. The big offices, I don't know, listeners will know, offices like OMA, MVRDV, and so had this real amazing grounding in housing that I would never have acquired if I'd stayed here. And of course the Dutch too, they build housing, not houses. They don't do individual. So, of course, the thing when I've come back to New Zealand and see is that the architecture circulates around the private dwelling or the bloated batch. And this is great, but these are all luxury devices in terms of how we understand housing.
So when you say housing, and in the Dutch experience, what does that mean?
So housing is mass housing. It's not the individual dwelling. It's more likely to be apartment blocks. Yes, there is terrace housing, but by and large, it's the apartment block approach to housing. And over there, those are the best jobs, and they attract the best architects, not the worst. So that's where the maximum amount of experimentation goes. And so these offices like OMA, MVRDV, NL Architects have created some of the best housing, social housing we'll see on the planet. And so that was extremely inspirational to see that it's at the spectrum where the residents wouldn't be affording the architect, that there was other systems such as mass housing which produced really exciting work. And the other thing about the Netherlands, and we could have been colonised by the Dutch if it hung around a bit longer. And I always speculate. Well, I was working not far from Outer Zealand, which is old Zealand, and thinking how green the Netherlands is by design, and how green New Zealand is by accident. And of course, so to come back and also see that the travesty what's happening to rivers and waterways and our suburban sprawl.
What do you think Aotearoa New Zealand would have looked like if Van Diemen and Tasman had said, right, this is ours in Dutch.
Well, I can have a fairly clear idea of that, because every time I fly back to Motiti from Tauranga Airport, I fly over the sprawl that is now Tauranga, Mount Maunganui and Papamoa. And, there would have been a place for dense. There's 2 or 3 towers on the main part of the beach at the moment, but there could have easily have been, something more like a surface paradise, or something more like I've seen on the Belgian coastline or Costa Iberica. There's a model where you could have had towers. First of all, they would have stopped the sprawl. Secondly, everybody who lives in those towers actually would see the sea, which is unlike the majority of people who live at the Mount, usually 3 or 4 rows back from the beach. And it would have just been a different kind of building. And I don't think density is necessarily the antithesis of the natural landscape. In fact, density protects the natural landscape and just stops sprawl. So, yes, I would have advocated for much taller dwellings, towers, and also not the domain of cities. You can do rural towers, provincial towers, vertical papakainga, sort of good models. And why would you do that? Why would you build a tower in say, a place like Te Teko? Because it's just a cheaper way of building. It's compact. You reduce the footprint on the land. It leaves the land more available for things like agriculture and horticulture. So that's just some of the sort of things I'm getting into over here. But so I'm advocating for a greater density.
Fascinating, because not just in the big cities, but particularly
outside.
Yeah. Now I'm curious. In your presentation, you talked quite a bit about land titles and the dispersed holdings. Can you go into a bit more depth for those people who haven't got their heads around, exactly how dispersed and how many people?
Sure. So first of all, let's understand the psychology behind this, that Māori land is quintessentially different from a European title. In Te Ao Māori, in the Māori world, we belong to the land does not belong to us. This is an idea of land which is not commodified, therefore we've seen the speculation in housing which has just driven those sort of prices north. But in the Māori world, land is bequeathed and passed down from one generation to another. Now, of course, where we find ourselves, it's a couple of events which have happened in history. Of course, Te Tiriti wasn't very good for Māori land ownership. Actually, Māori lost a majority of their land after, and I always remind people, after the treaty was signed, not before. And that's effectively left Māori today, that's 17% of the country owning just 6% of the land. But that land is not in cities. It's usually in difficult places to access. It's usually sides of mountains. It's usually often bush. It can be forests. So it's slightly inaccessible. But more than that is you've got to understand this idea that because one land gets passed down from one generation to another, we now have, I think, 2.3 million Māori land interests. That's 2.3 different shareholding interests in Māori land. Now, given that Māori are just 800,000, that's nearly, you can sort of see the mathematics. So I'm just going to read you something. So in 2011, there were 27,137 Māori land titles. So 27,000 Māori land titles and 2.3 million interests in the land. So what we're seeing is the balkanisation or the fragmentation of land into tiny parcels with multiple interests in that land. And of course, so my research is interested in first of all, there is anecdotal evidence of three different types actually. First of all, some Māori don't even know they own the land because of this crazy numeracy. Secondly, some land interests are deceased. And so these kinds of things have also problematized the administration and management of land. So the sort of research I'm interested in is how to agglomerate shareholdings. So I know through my father's, from a personal perspective, he would own interest in about 60 different land blocks from his father's generation as they've been passed down. Some of them are on places like Taupo. Now, I don't really go to Taupo and I don't even really whakapapa to Taupo, but hey, there are shares and blocks of land in and around that area. And I think if we could try to find a system, ideally non-monetised, because that would take the sort of the kind of fiscal issues slightly out of it. But if we find a non-monetised system for Māori to be able to swap the shares in land, which they have no interest in, those blocks of land down in Taupo, which I don't, because I don't happen to go to Taupo, in return for maybe there are shares on Mōtiti or places where I do have an emotional attachment to, then we could reduce and agglomerate the number of shareholders. And so I think that's possible through something like using NFTs, and that's which are an accountable public ledger, and they could access the Māori land online, which has got full information of all shareholders. So there's the data set on Māori land online, and then through that applying an NFT as a sort of a non-monetised market to exchange shares, and it's up to the individuals to work out how many shares on one block they want to give away for shares in another, and that's a private discussion, and it's just a matter of being able to find a way to assign that those shares away.
So how would it work? Let's say, for example, I have shares in 5 or 6 blocks all over the Mōtiti, and my now deceased auntie and grandmother have got shares as well, and everyone's agreed that yes, we can combine these. How might that work in NFT? Because blockchain is a perfect way to track ownership changes and to understand where it is and not have it owned by some government department or something.
So the first thing what I would do, which we've done with my father's actually shareholders, is basically just get a spreadsheet of where they are. Now, these shareholders are always usually of the order of one or less than 1%. And we're talking like tiny shareholdings, but sometimes they can be quite large. The land's often in hectares, so you still could have an entitlement to say 1,000 square metres. So one would first of all have to identify what they would have to be a bit active and undertake and find out where and what shareholdings they have. And the second thing is, from that process, you'd have to work out what your priorities are, and then you'd have to be active and going through the Māori land to find out those shareholders and then making contact. So now, again, it would be, this is something we want to get going and putting into practice. But I think in the first initial stages, yes, there's a bit of work required by those who want to participate. But of course, I'd use put myself in that trialling beta period testing. But that's how it would essentially work. You'd have to be active in finding which of the other those other parties who have interest in the land that you want, and then reaching out.
So one of the reasons for doing this is to pull together and make it easy to make decisions about what to do, particularly with housing.
Sure.
Can you give us an idea of how that shakeout, if you like, could help make it easier to get a lot more housing done where it's needed?
Sure. So once you've reduced the number of landowner interests, and of course through that process you'll then find out who's alive and did it. It's much easier then to configure yourselves. As invariably these are Māori configure themselves as trusts. And once you have a trust, obviously, then you have the ability to raise finance against security, because the trust would have a mandate to secure finance. At the moment, the market's sort of saying though the loan to value ratios for trusts on Māori land are about 40 to 50%. So it's much less than the loan to values say on European title, but nonetheless, it's happening. Because a few years ago it wasn't happening. And then, of course, the types of buildings you're likely to build on that land won't be individually owned. They have to be collectively owned. And so we would be looking at, and we've done one at the moment where the land was in an area where most of the hapu lived in the cities. Māori are highly urbanising faster than non-Māori at the moment. And so they return back to these places for summer, for tangi, for weddings, etc., etc. So they don't actually need to live there all the time. So if you take this idea of timeshare, and then you could basically be designing and building what we call build-to-rent housing, which is basically, and it could be offered to members of the hapu on a timeshare basis rather than collective ownership.
You mentioned one particular project where people could go and have holidays, I suppose.
Yes, that's right.
And at the same time be able to Airbnb some of the shares.
Yeah, so we did some financial modelling. I think the build cost is something like, so what we do as part of this research, we do full business plans. So, I think the build costs come in at something like 10 million or something. But then you add in, fees and you work it out. And then you have to work back, offset that against the income which it needs to generate. So in this case, it was housing for 100. You could imagine most hapu are about, let's say, 5,000 strong. And so you don't want the situation where we're building a few housing, and there are issues when you're building a few housing for you, and you've got a 5,000 strong, hapu. And like I said, particularly when you've shaken the can on this NFT approach to ownership, you'll still be left with interest in the hundreds. It's unlikely to just go down to one. But anyway, so you know that you're going to have to try to accommodate greater numbers. And so working on the basis of 5,000 as a hapu, and you get 100, you can work out that if each of those members was allowed to stay 2 weeks, that would give, it's 2 weeks, 100 people, and then divide, so 26. So over a year times 26, you would have accommodated 2,600. So if you've got a hapu of 5,000, then you offer them a week each. So it's basically trying to do it as a timeshare. I mean, I was sort of equipped that the model's a brotel, which is a sort of part motel for Māori. But and then how you pay for it? Well, we were working on numbers of around $25 per night per person. So if you had 100 a night, times 25, it's 2,500. Sort of 15,000 a week. So you can start to see 15,000 a week. What's that, over 750 a year? 750,000. You can sort of see how the numbers could stack up, and see it could start to service some of that repayment against the build development costs. And of course, the safety net is where members of who are shareholders don't stay. You can put the places on Airbnb in the areas we were looking at, something like $200 a night. So there's this sort of safety net in terms of maintaining the income generation. So, and many of these lands are in areas like, I'm we've got land in Whakatane on coastlands, and, it's right next to the beach. And so you start to see how you can generate income and employment for Māori in such areas.
When the Facts Change is brought to you in partnership with KiwiBank to help you understand the issues affecting the economy. And that's what their team of experts is here to do too. Here's KiwiBank's Chief Economist Jared Kerr with his prediction on what we can expect from the housing market and interest rates for 2024.
We've seen quite a correction in housing across the country. So house prices fell from the lofty levels that we saw in 2021. The Reserve Bank has pushed house prices down by design and by lifting interest rates to very eye-watering levels. I think the housing market has found a bottom, and I think we'll see house prices rising over 2024 and into 25-26. The housing market will be better balanced. We have seen a surge in migrants, which is adding demand to the housing market, and I think we'll see house prices naturally lift on the back of that surge in migration and hopefully an easing in interest rates later on.
Visit kiwibank.co.nz to stay up to date with detailed economic analysis and forecasts from Jared and other Kiwibank experts. They take big issues from both here and overseas and make them relevant to Kiwi businesses.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
Another big part of your presentation was around the use of laminated timber to build particularly bigger buildings and housing arrangements. So typically people have thought of timber buildings being, it's a standalone 3-bedroom house, a Lockwood or something. But you've had experience of using laminated timber in Britain to produce medium density housing. Tell us about the opportunity there and how it could be done.
Well, nice. So from NFT to CLT, I grew up in a place called Kawerau. They had a pulp and paper mill called Tasman. And like many Māori, we have a stronger affinity and connection to the forests. You know, I think nearly 40% of the forestry workforce is Māori. CLT, for those listeners, is cross-laminated timber. And the best way to sort of think of it is plywood and steroids or supersized plywood. So instead of plywood coming like 20mm sheets, we were using thicknesses of 250 mil in our floors. So it's not like timber stud frames that we typically see in housing. This is thick, solid wooden panels made out of softwoods, which are glued together and cross-plied, so at 90 degrees, and they're relatively lightweight. And, it's absolutely appalling that we haven't, being a timber country with, I think, Kāinga Ora was the Southern Hemisphere's second largest man-made forest, so that we haven't taken our and also the country is covered with 40% of forest anyway, and we haven't taken all that natural resources and added value to it by processing timber. At the moment, we're exporting raw logs to China, who in turn have been subsidised by the Chinese government to then go on and process it. And I think there's a definite need, and I think there's a transformation plan which has just been released last month to prioritise the use of logs and adding value to them to produce CLT and stuff like that. So in the UK, we were using, we used a Spanish company. It was a 5-storey building, came flat packed on 5 massive articulated trucks.
And the beauty of CLT is that it's very controllable. So you create these sheets and you can use CNC machines to slice them up in exactly the right amounts, and so that you don't have to worry, as you often do with 4x2s or whatever.
No twisting, no warping. So like on site, there's no warped stud, and you don't have to worry about keeping them dry. So the other problem with So stud framing is warping, twisting, the humidity and issues. So it doesn't matter. CLT is so thick, so the walls are typically 100 mil solid. They don't catch fire because, from lighting a barbecue, you don't use a log to start fire. You need kindling. So you can get 60 to 90 minute fire ratings, no problem. If you want to, as we did in London, we coated the CLT with a flame retardant called Envirograph, which reduces the ignition point by another 20 minutes. So we had 80-minute fire rating, so it's good for fire. As you said, it's really easy to. The architects in their offices would be using CAD, so these CAD packages and 3D printing go straight to the factories where they use CNC and cut it out. So you can get tolerances on windows up to between 1 and 2 millimeters. So typically with a timber frame, you put the frame up, window guy comes along when the frame's all up with the rough openings, measures it all up, and then makes the windows. This is not required with CLT because the dimensional accuracy straight off the drawing means that you can order the windows probably even before you start cutting the frame, before you start cutting the CLT panels. So it's got massive traction in the United Kingdom. It's green. It's got its carbon is sequestered within the...
It literally is a carbon sink that you live in.
That's right. It's a carbon sink. Now, one thing, some people don't like our company doesn't use jibboard, plasterboard.
Yes. So there's no need to wait for Fletcher to make the
jibboard, I do say that maybe they should be thinking about setting up a CLT factory. They've certainly got the financial resources for it. So we don't use plasterboard in ours. And so what do you see when you look at the walls? You see a sort of pine, a bit like a Swedish sauna from the 70s. But hey, if that's that's slightly more empathetic. I noticed amongst the younger generation today that seeing raw materials is more empathetic with a world which is going through climate change and all that. And so I think this masking, using plasterboard to mask things is not so great. And the other thing with CLT, you can surface fix the electrical, so we put it in conduit and we just surface mount it to the walls. So it has a kind of aesthetic. This is for affordable housing. It's not for bling luxury housing.
And a lot more could be done off-site as well before it comes in.
Yeah, so it's off-site manufacturing, and you just literally tilt up slab, stand it up, and we would build the entire structure. There's floors usually something around 250 mil thick for a 7 metre span. Walls about 110 mil thick. So we would do the stairs out of it. So you can do the entire superstructure, and it's fantastic, and it's so fast direct, unbelievable. So we can do 5 stories in 2 weeks, and that's it. So of course back here I'm advocating that if we fix Māori housing, we fix housing for all. So of course I'm trying to push that. Let's reduce the means of construction that we have. So there are lots of forms of off-site manufacturing, from volumetric to SIPs, structural insulated panels, etc. But we're a small nation, and I think with this forestry resource, I think we should focus on trying to do all forms of off-site manufacturing. I'm advocating that we get into mass engineering timber products, CLT, glulam, and develop that housing. And if we become master of a few things rather than trying to tempt too many ways of construction, that's my approach to trying to disrupt the affordability issues we're suffering in housing today.
Particularly for iwi who own forests and control forests, and where the forests are close to where you want to build the housing, and when you've got control of land, there is an opportunity here to invest in these off-site and CLT plants, build lots of housing that's close by, but also export it to the cities.
Well, yes. Well, it's interesting too, because if you did an overlay, which I'm not sure if you recall from yesterday, but an overlay of where Māori land is, and it is very close to those forests, and so Māori are in those sort of zones where not only have you is there a forest culture traditionally, but they're actually well located. And of course, yes, we just need to, particularly as I know around about 70% of iwi have had their settlement claims of Te Tiriti, but there's still more to come, and increasingly Māori will own 50% of the exotic forests. So we may not get our land back, but you'll get forests, and of course we want to put forests to use. And I think here's an opportunity to create employment too, because if New Zealand can start now sending processed timber abroad, where we're going to send it. We're going to send it to places like Australia, Southeast Asia. There are only 2 of the 66 producers of CLT. All but 2 are in the Northern Hemisphere. And so
it seems like a perfect match where you have the forests here, which aren't being used to their full potential in terms of creating value and creating jobs here. They're often on iwi land. There is a problem. We need to build lots of housing for Māori, and doing it in a way which is faster and happens to be much better for the climate too seems obvious.
Yeah, that's right. And also, the export value of that. So the 15% of logs which we do process, send it abroad, earning 40% of the forestry revenue. So you can sort of see the kind of value it is to the economy, and we just need to apply some governmental fiscal and policy levers to stimulate, encourage growth. At the moment, we do have red stag, but of course, like any environment, it's also good to have more than to avoid a monopoly and have more than one player.
And that's particularly up and down the country.
That's right, and red stag are great, but there's also there's a capacity, and I think they're showing excellent leadership, but there's also opportunities for others, and and those forests we're never going to exhaust the supply. And of course, we're active in reforestation and carbon crediting, so that's good for the future.
So to wrap up, then, a potential to use NFTs and CLT to deal with our housing and our climate issues.
Yeah, so I'm saying use the NFT to produce CLT so that we can build BTR housing that's built around housing.
Fantastic. Kia ora, Anthony.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you so much for the time.
Wonderful that you were able to be on When the Facts Change.
Excellent. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with KiwiBank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how KiwiBank are making Kiwi better off.
Love news but find keeping up a bit overwhelming? Well, Newsable is the answer. It's your daily fix of everything worth talking about. I'm your host, Imogen Wells, and in about 15 minutes, I'll bring you what you need to know from Aotearoa and around the world and explain why it matters. Newsable tackles the big stuff without taking itself too seriously. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.